individual autonomy. So that's Machiavelli in the 16th century. And in the 16th century, Luther also developed this conception of Christian freedoms. And Luther is very, very important for Kant, as well as the context of Descartes and the context of modernity, the emergence of modernity. And I don't think we pay enough attention to Luther in the context of modern philosophy. I think some people have started paying a bit more attention to him. But I think, as Marx noted somewhere, Luther's conception was important in the development of the modern conception of autonomy. And it is very important to understand Luther's conception in order to understand Kant's invention of morality as autonomy. Now, Luther, in his very influential work, Freedom of Christians, Freedom of a Christian, develops his conception of autonomy. And freedom is obviously a very important concept, because we understand the conception of autonomy, as we saw in Machiavelli as well, in terms of positive and negative freedom. So Luther talks about, now Luther was working in the context of his fight against the hegemony of the Roman Church, or the Catholic Church. So that when he's talking about Christian freedom, he's talking about freedom from Roman Church as well. And he's talking about, so it's foremost freedom from the institution of church, and freedom from the Pope and his whole institution of papacy as the mediatory between self and God. So Luther's conception of freedom as freedom from, or negative freedom. So this negative freedom is freedom from, foremost, it is a freedom from Roman Catholic Church, and its mediation between God and the Christian self. But then it is also freedom from flesh, or freedom from desires. Dependence on desires. So, and I guess freedom from social ties in a sense as well. Freedom from body. And this conception of freedom comes, I think there is a whole tradition in Christianity from St. Paul to Augustine, where this conception of freedom, that sense of dependence, is prominent. In Paul, that was freedom from the law of Torah and the law of Moses as well. So, and in Luther you will find all those elements. And Augustine obviously is a freedom from the desires as well. And both Augustine and Luther are very very close disciples of St. Paul. I mean, I'm calling him a saint just because that's how he is referred to, not that I believe he was a saint. So this is freedom from dependence, or autonomy as freedom from dependence. But then there's a positive conception of freedom in Luther as well. And that is freedom to obey God's laws. This God's law is not the law of church, Roman, not the law of Moses, because it is cursed, according to Paul. So this God's law is some sort of a minimalist spiritual law. And like Kant's categorical imperative, it is empty as well, because if you read Luther closely, you will see that in Luther, this freedom to obey God's law is basically freedom to love God. And this loving God is of a self, a Christian self, which is an atomized self, because this self is detached from the social surroundings, from the even bodily surroundings and the surrounding of the institutions, especially the institution of the Catholic Church. So this self is a very minimalist and bare self. And its relationship with God is unmediated even by body. And God is there, another self or a spirit. And this pure relation of self to self is where this freedom is manifested. And Luther is very careful to point out that there's no external manifestation of this love of God or this obedience to the law of God. And that's why he called it freedom. Otherwise, how can you call a law of freedom? Obedience to law of freedom. Precisely because this law is empty, it can make possible a Christian freedom. Anyway, and Kant basically, account of autonomy is the development of the Luther's. Kant's account of autonomy is in a sense a transformation, and critique of Luther's account. And the thing which he will critique is even this empty reference to the obedience to God's law. Kant develop a critique of this, because for Kant, obedience is heteronomy. So even if you are obeying God, you are heteronymous. Morality can't be obedience to God's law, because morality is autonomy. And if morality is autonomy, it can't be obedience. So one of critiques of Kant, Luther's critique of Kant, is the critique of the conception of morality. The conception of morality as obedience. For Kant, morality cannot be obedience. Because not even obedience to God's will. Because for him, as for Luther, morality is freedom, autonomy. And obedience to God's will is heteronomy. So that would be the beginning of Kant's transformation or transposition of Luther's conception of religious autonomy, religious conception of autonomy, into a moral conception of autonomy, where basically it will involve rejection of morality as obedience of God's will or God's law, and God's will, and assertion of morality as personal autonomy, self-legislation, where human gives law to themselves, in a sense in which we already see glimpse in Luther, where self obey itself and nothing else. So there's obedience, but that's self-determination or self-governance. That's why it is autonomy. And in that sense, Kant's moral philosophy is closely related to the conception to Luther, to Protestantism, to St. Augustine, and to Paul. The conception of Paul as the law, conception of Paul, whereby he claims that the law of God is a curse, and that Jesus, Masih al-Islam, Nawzullah, came to overthrow that curse. Okay, we'll stop here and we'll continue with this and hopefully it will develop into something useful where we can learn about these different conceptions.